The fluorescent lights hummed their electric dirge at 2:47 in the morning. Oak Creek Memorial's emergency department moved with the dull rhythm of a graveyard shift, the kind of shift where the dying came quietly and the living pretended not to notice. Natalie Hayes stood in the pharmacy alcove, her left leg angled just slightly to distribute weight evenly, fingers moving through the controlled substance log with the precision of someone reading a dead language she'd never forgotten. Morphine. Oxycodone. Hydromorphone. The numbers didn't match. 217 units missing from the counts, logged as dispensed but never entered into the patient records. It was the kind of discrepancy that made her stomach tighten, that made her hand instinctively move to the small shape beneath her scrubs, the dog tag on the broken chain, worn smooth from 2 years of constant pressure against her ribs. She'd come to Oak Creek to disappear. To become nobody. Just a night shift nurse with a limp nobody asked about and a past that stayed buried under antiseptic and fluorescent light. 2 years of keeping her head down, her voice soft, her hands occupied with tasks that didn't require anyone to look too closely at her. 2 years of being invisible, and invisible was what she needed. Invisible meant safe. Invisible meant not having to explain the way her hands moved when muscle memory took over, not having to talk about Helmand Province or the husband whose dog tag she wore or why she sometimes woke up in the middle of a shift with her ears ringing from phantom explosions. But the inventory discrepancies were wrong. Not the kind of wrong you could ignore. The kind of wrong that had gotten 7 Marines killed in Kandahar province when someone decided to skim supplies instead of making sure the surgical kits were full. The kind of wrong that made her hands move toward the phone, that made her want to run every number again, to verify each entry against the patient charts. 3 hospital-wide audits in 2 years. She knew the system. She knew what the gaps meant. The door opened behind her so quietly she would have missed it if she hadn't spent 14 years learning to hear the difference between footsteps, which ones carried intention, which ones carried threat. Dr. Marcus Caldwell stood in the pharmacy doorway, his expression shifting so fast most people would have missed it. But Natalie saw the flash across his face before he locked it down, panic, sharp and animal. Then it was gone, replaced by the smooth administrative concern he wore like a tailored suit. Caldwell was good at this. 58 years old, 15 years as ER director, knew everyone on the hospital board by their first names, had photos of his children on his desk in frames that cost more than Natalie's car. The kind of man who moved through institutions like water, who made his presence felt without ever appearing dangerous. Nurse Hayes. His voice carried that particular tone of physicians addressing nursing staff, not quite contempt, not quite curiosity, something more like the way a chess player might acknowledge a pawn. "You're here late." She didn't turn immediately. She set the inventory tablet down on the counter, her movement deliberate and unhurried, the kind of movement that suggested she had nothing to hide and nothing to prove. When she did turn, her face was neutral, her eyes level with his, showing nothing. "Inventory reconciliation, Doctor." The counts were inconsistent. His smile didn't reach his eyes. That was the thing about intelligent people, they made their masks better than most, but the eyes always held the truth if you knew how to read them. And Natalie knew how to read people. She'd had to, once. When eyes were the only thing that told you whether someone would bleed out or hold long enough for the medevac, whether they'd stay lucid or start having seizures, whether they could make it another hour or if you needed to move them now. She could read Caldwell the way she'd read vital signs. "I'll handle the audit from here," he said, his voice dropping into something softer, more concerned. The voice of a man taking a burden from someone's shoulders. "You focus on patient care. Those counts can be tricky, the old system sometimes doesn't sync properly with the new one. Software glitches, you know how it is." It wasn't a question. It was a suggestion, the kind that came with the weight of institutional authority behind it. He stepped forward, and his hand moved toward the tablet with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to his decisions being unquestioned. Natalie could have moved. Could have shifted the tablet away, could have spoken directly about what the numbers meant. Could have pulled the emergency protocol trigger and started an official investigation. She'd known people who would have. She'd commanded people who would have, in a different life, in a place where speaking up meant something. Instead, she nodded once. A small, slight movement of her head. Acceptance. Compliance. The kind of response expected from a tired night shift nurse who didn't want complications, who wanted to finish her shift and go home. She released the tablet without comment, and her right hand, the one steady as a surgical laser, the one that had clamped bleeding vessels and sutured skin back together under mortar fire, dropped back to her side. The dog tag beneath her scrubs caught the fluorescent light for just a moment as she shifted her weight, the chain making the smallest sound, metal against fabric. She watched his eyes track downward for just an instant, saw him register something, the shape beneath the cotton, the particular way it Saturday. For half a second, his composure faltered. Then it was back in place, sealed over like a vault door closing. Good. Thank you, Natalie. That's very dedicated of you. He'd switched to her first name, a small domestication of authority that made it harder to object, that transformed the interaction from institutional to personal. Go check on the patient in Bay 3. He came in about an hour ago, laceration from a car accident. Dr. Chen's with him, but if you could assist with the sutures, that would be helpful. It wasn't a request. It was a command wrapped in a question, the way administrative physicians sometimes spoke to nursing staff. The way people spoke to people they'd already decided were subordinate. Natalie turned without answering and walked out of the pharmacy, her limp barely perceptible if you weren't looking for it. She could feel his eyes on her back, feel the weight of his attention in the way the air seemed to shift. The dog tag beneath her shirt pressed against her sternum, Marcus, engraved into the metal, the letters worn smooth. Marcus Hayes. Her husband's name, the letters soft from 14 years of contact, from moments like this when she needed to remember who she'd been, what she'd survived, what she'd lost trying to save people who didn't matter to people who didn't care. Bay 3 smelled like copper and alcohol, the astringent burn of disinfectant mixing with something darker, something that made the older parts of her brain respond with recognition. Blood. Not much, not dangerous, but blood nonetheless. Dr. Chen stood over a male patient in his early 40s, a construction worker from the looks of him, with a 2-inch laceration across his left forearm and the kind of trembling exhaustion that came with adrenaline crash. A car accident. A piece of broken glass at the right angle. The kind of injury that would scar if stitched poorly, would heal perfectly if done with precision. Dr. Chen, I'll assist, Natalie said, and something shifted in the ER around her. Not anything visible, not anything most people would notice. But Chen, a solid surgeon with 9 years at Oak Creek, looked up and something changed in his expression. Recognition, maybe. Or maybe just professional relief at having competent hands available at 2:53 in the morning. Perfect, Chen said. We'll need a 4.0 suture, local anesthesia. He pulled a tray closer, began prepping the wound with economical movements. This is going to leave some scar tissue unless we get the margins absolutely clean. Natalie gathered the materials without being asked, the 4.0 silk sutures, the lignocaine, the small curved needle. Her hands moved with the kind of automatic precision that came from doing something 5,000 times, 10,000 times, doing it in conditions where failure meant watching someone die. The muscles in her forearms tensed and released in a rhythm she didn't have to think about. Her fingers accepted the needle the way a gunfighter's hand accepts a trigger, muscle memory that predated this life by more than a decade. She worked in silence beside Chen, and she could feel the shift in his body as he registered the quality of her work. Not just competent. Not just adequate. The kind of suturing that belonged in an operating room, the kind that belonged in a surgical program at Johns Hopkins or Walter Reed. The kind of hands that had learned this skill in conditions that would have broken most people, that had stitched together wounds in places where the electricity came from a generator and the anesthesia was whatever you had left in the bag. 1 stitch. 2. 3. The needle went in and out with the rhythm of breathing, each placement exact, each knot tied with the kind of tension that would hold without strangulation, that would allow healing without excessive scarring. The patient's arm lay still beneath her hands, and something in her chest eased slightly, not pain, not fear, but the particular calm that came from being exactly where her hands were supposed to be, doing exactly what they were meant to do. That's excellent work, Chen said quietly, after the fourth stitch. His voice held something like surprise, as if he'd expected competence and found artistry instead. "Just practice," Natalie said, and the words came out softer than she intended, the kind of deflection that came naturally now. "Just a nurse. Just someone doing her job. Just someone who didn't belong anywhere else, who couldn't be anywhere else, who had to stay invisible because visibility meant questions and questions meant answers she wasn't prepared to give." She didn't notice Dr. Caldwell standing at the edge of Bay 3 until she was tying the final stitch. He stood with his hands in his pockets, watching her work with an intensity that made the hair on the back of her neck respond. His eyes were narrow, focused, the way a predator's eyes focus when they realize they've miscalculated something about potential prey. He was registering something, the precision of her movements, the confidence in her hands, the way she moved in Chen space without hesitation or doubt. The way her hands moved like they were remembering something older and darker and infinitely more dangerous than stitching up construction workers in an emergency department at 3 in the morning. The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then Caldwell turned and walked away, his shoes clicking against the tile floor with the distinctive sound of someone moving with purpose. But before he left, Natalie saw something in his expression that made her blood run cold. It wasn't anger. It wasn't even fear. It was recognition. And he'd already begun to make calculations about what that recognition would require him to do. It wasn't a request. It was a command, and within 7 days, the rotating night shifts began. Monday, then Wednesday, then Friday, never the same pattern twice. Natalie arrived each evening to find the schedule had shifted again, making it impossible to build rapport with any consistent team, to learn the names of the night residents, to establish the kind of seamless communication that kept patients alive when things went wrong. The break room felt different now. When she sat down with her lunch on Tuesday at 11:15 p.m., the 3 nurses already at the table, Sarah from trauma, Michelle from ICU, and a travel nurse named Derek, suddenly remembered they had charting to finish. All at once. Sarah's half-eaten sandwich sat abandoned on the table. Natalie didn't acknowledge them leaving. She didn't flinch. She ate her salad in silence while the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like agitated wasps, and by Wednesday night, when she reached for a chair at the staff table, the room cleared before she even sat down. This happened 4 times in 1 week. The public destruction came on a Friday morning during rounds in room 412. Mrs. Patterson lay in a hospital bed with her 3 adult children arranged in chairs like a tribunal, 2 spouses standing behind them, all of them with the tense shoulders of people waiting for bad news. Dr. Caldwell swept into the room with his white coat crisp as fresh money, his smile already calibrated to appear sympathetic while his eyes scanned the room for advantage. Natalie stood at the foot of the bed, required to attend rounds, her clipboard held against her chest like a shield. She wore the same scrubs she'd worn 4 days in a row because nobody had told her the schedule in advance, and the cotton smelled faintly of antiseptic and something like defeat. Dr. Caldwell reviewed the medication orders aloud, his voice carrying the particular cadence of a man performing intelligence for an audience. Mrs. Patterson is responding well to her current regimen. The afternoon dose of metoprolol will continue, and we're maintaining the morphinet. He paused, checking the chart. 200 milligrams every 4 hours. Natalie's body went rigid. Not the dramatic kind of rigid. The small kind, the kind only another medical professional would recognize. Her jaw tightened. Her eyes moved to the dosage line on the monitor. 200 milligrams of morphine every 4 hours for a 73-year-old woman with compromised renal function was enough to suppress her respiratory drive into arrest. It was the kind of mistake that killed people quietly, the kind that looked like natural progression rather than negligence. Dr. Caldwell, that's 200 milligrams of, her voice came out quiet, respectful, the voice she'd spent 2 years perfecting. He cut her off before the second word finished. Nurse Hayes. His smile didn't waver, but something sharp moved behind his eyes. Are you a physician? No, but... Then perhaps you should leave the medical decisions to those of us with actual training. He turned back to the family with the ease of a man who'd just dismissed an irritating sound. Mrs. Patterson's eldest daughter shifted in her chair, uncomfortable. One of the spouses leaned forward slightly, then caught himself. Natalie took one measured breath. The kind of breath they taught you in combat medicine training, the kind that steadies your hands when you're holding someone's open chest cavity. She met Dr. Caldwell's eyes. A single tear escaped, not from weakness, but from the specific rage of knowing exactly what he'd just done and exactly how he'd done it. She wiped it away without breaking eye contact, her hand moving with mechanical precision. When she spoke, her voice had dropped half an octave. It came out like a scalpel moving through skin. "I've seen men die from less than this dose, Doctor." The room went so quiet you could hear the ventilator in the adjacent unit wheeze its mechanical rhythm through the walls. Mrs. Patterson's daughter stared. One of the spouses looked at their partner with an expression that suggested they'd just heard something they weren't supposed to hear. Dr. Caldwell's smile became something else, something thin and vicious, like a knife showing its edge. He closed the chart with deliberate slowness and turned to face her fully, his presence in the room making the air pressure change, becoming heavier, denser, more dangerous. "And I've seen nurses, especially our little ghost nurse here, the one who limps around thinking she knows better than everyone, lose their licenses for insubordination." His voice stayed perfectly calm, which made it worse. "You're transferred to the psychiatric unit effective immediately. Collect your things before your next shift." Natalie nodded once. A single, definitive movement. She turned and walked out of the room with perfect posture despite the slight hitch in her left leg where the shrapnel had tunneled through, past Mrs. Patterson's stunned family, past Dr. Caldwell's thin smile. Her badge clattered against the file holder on the wall as she brushed past it. Nobody moved to stop her. That afternoon, she watched Dr. Caldwell make 3 phone calls from his office while she finished her charting. She heard him say her name to someone at Duke Medical Center, then to someone at UNC, then to someone at a hospital in Charlotte. She heard him use the phrase emotional instability each time. She heard him say unauthorized procedures and breach of trust and safety concern. By evening, she'd received notifications that her applications to 3 hospitals had been rejected before they were even properly filed. The word was already out. The kill order was already placed. What they didn't know was that everything had changed the moment she'd said those 13 words in front of that family. What they didn't know was that a young Marine from the 2nd Battalion stationed at Camp Lejeune had been in the waiting room during afternoon visiting hours, using the hospital bathroom, and had heard those 13 words through the open door of room for 12. He would report them to exactly the wrong person. Or perhaps the right person, depending on how you measured it. That evening, the ER received its first critical alert at 1800 hours. A Marine general, 62 years old, highly decorated, in Raleigh for a military ceremony at the Raleigh Convention Center, had collapsed during the opening remarks. Cardiac event, possible MI, EMS in progress. The siren started 3 minutes later. Natalie was still in the ER, still scheduled for her final shift before the psychiatric unit transfer took effect. She'd been assigned to stock the crash cart, a task designed to keep her busy and visible and out of the way. When the ambulance bay doors burst open, she was holding a box of sterile gauze pads. The organized chaos of military presence arrived before the patient did, 3 uniformed Marines in dress blues, moving with the fluid precision of people trained in threat assessment, establishing a perimeter even though this was a hospital, even though there was no visible threat. Just habit. Just muscle memory. The stretcher wheeled through at a run. CPR in progress. A young female paramedic was straddling the general's chest, her gloved hands pushing down with the kind of rhythm that said she'd been at it for minutes already. His color was wrong, the grayish blue of someone whose heart had stopped doing its job, whose organs were beginning their slow shutdown. Natalie set down the gauze box. Her hands moved before her mind caught up, before she could remember that she was supposed to be invisible, before she could think about psych transfers or Dr. Caldwell or any of it. She was moving toward the trauma bay, toward the general, toward the code. The resident on duty, a man named Chen who'd only been out of residency for 3 months, was calling orders that didn't quite match the rhythm needed, that didn't account for the general's age, his color, the pattern of his collapse. Natalie pushed past him with a single word, thoracotomy. It wasn't a request. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, delivered in the voice of someone who'd already decided. "We don't have time for," Chen started. "Crash cart. Now. And get me the thoracotomy kit." The kit arrived 30 seconds later, and that's when the hands of fate, or perhaps the hands of Dr. Caldwell, standing frozen in the doorway of the trauma bay, finally understanding what he was looking at, began to close. The sterile packaging jammed. The metal edge caught on the drawer release, a manufacturing defect that happened once every 5,000 times, and it happened now, at this moment, with a Marine general coding out his last heartbeats on the table. Natalie's eyes found the crash cart. Found the scalpel. Without hesitation, her fingers closed around it. The blade was smooth and cold against her palm, familiar in a way that made her want to scream. She'd used instruments like this before, but never on this continent, never in a hospital, never in front of witnesses wearing uniforms. She made the incision between the general's ribs with the kind of precision that comes from doing something under mortar fire, from doing it while your husband was bleeding out 20 meters away, from doing it and having your hand steady when everything else was falling apart. The rib spread. Blood soaked her scrubs to the elbows, warm and copper-smelling, the kind of smell that doesn't belong in a sterile American hospital. Her fingers entered the chest cavity. Found the bleed. Clamped it with her bare hand, using the kind of pressure that took training or instinct or something worse than both. "Get me a vascular clamp," she said quietly. Nobody moved. Everyone was staring. Dr. Caldwell was still frozen in the doorway, his face the color of spoiled milk, his jaw slack in a way that suggested his entire framework of the world had just tilted 45 degrees off its axis. Chen was holding the defibrillator pads like they'd suddenly become incomprehensible. A young Marine MP, maybe 23, maybe younger, with a too smooth face of someone still carrying baby fat in his cheekbones, pushed into the trauma bay to secure the perimeter and stopped dead when he saw her. His eyes went to her hands, covered in blood up to the forearms. Went to her face, calm as water. Then dropped to the dog tag that had slipped out from her collar when she bent over the general's open chest, dangling now in the arterial spray, a single piece of tarnished metal catching the surgical lights. His voice carried weight, recognition, the particular tone someone uses when they're looking at something they thought only existed in stories. He whispered it like a prayer. Like a confirmation. Like a warning. Natalie didn't look up. She didn't acknowledge him. But her jaw tightened, and somewhere in the core of her, something that had been carefully locked away for 2 years began to crack. The sirens didn't wail. They screamed. 2 of them, cutting through the humid North Carolina night like razor wire through silk, and Natalie heard them from the break room where she was supposed to be on psychiatric unit reassignment starting in 6 hours. She was on break, drinking cold coffee that tasted like surrender, when the intercom crackled to life, "All hands ER. Trauma alert. Marine General, 62, medical emergency en route. ETA for minutes." She set the cup down. Her hands didn't shake. They never did anymore. The convoy arrived with the precision of military logistics, 2 Hums, 1 unmarked sedan, and the ambulance screaming into the ER bay at 11:02 p.m. Natalie moved without conscious decision, muscle memory and institutional training pulling her toward Trauma Bay 3 before her rational mind caught up. The general lay on the stretcher, his dress blue soaked with sweat, his face the color of driftwood. 84-year-old Marine, someone said. Cardiac event during the ceremony. Defibrillator failed. He's been down for 7 minutes. The room exploded into motion. Dr. Caldwell stood at the head of the bed, his hands already gloved, barking orders with the confidence of a man who'd never failed at anything and didn't intend to start now. Chest compressions. 210 per minute. The rhythm monitor showed asystole, flat line, the silence of a heart that had given up. Blood hung on double poles. An attending was already calling for the thoracotomy kit. Open cardiac massage. Field procedure. The kind of thing you did when you'd run out of time and options. Natalie moved to the equipment cart without being asked. Her fingers found the scalpel, the retractors, the chest spreader. She'd done this before. Not in a hospital. In an aid station in Sanjin Valley with incoming fire close enough to taste the copper and cordite, with a young Marine, 23 years old, name of Richardson, bleeding out from an IED fragment that had nicked his left ventricle. She'd cracked his chest with a field knife because there was no kit, no time, no mercy in the mathematics of triage. He'd lived. She'd never told anyone. The thoracotomy kit arrived. The attending opened it with the focused intensity of someone who'd rehearsed this exactly once in medical school and never wanted to do it again. His hands moved toward the sterile field. Natalie positioned herself. The kit's catch mechanism stuck. Jammed. She heard the small metallic protest, heard the attending curse under his breath. 3 seconds. 4. The general's O2 sat was at 31 and falling. Brain death happened in minutes. Irreversible damage at 4. Dr. Caldwell froze. Not visibly. Not so anyone untrained would notice. But Natalie saw it in the way his jaw locked, the way his eyes went to the monitor as if the numbers might change if he stared hard enough. He was calculating odds. Running probabilities. Finding them all coming up short. Natalie moved. She didn't ask permission. She didn't call out. She simply stepped forward, blade already in her hand, a scalpel from the instrument tray, stainless steel catching the overhead lights, and made the first incision with a kind of clean, decisive stroke that comes from having done it before. Left anterolateral thoracotomy. She knew the anatomy like she knew her own heartbeat. Fourth intercostal space. Through the pleura. The ribs spread with a sound like breaking driftwood, and then the chest was open, and the world narrowed to the size of a human heart. There. The bleed. Left ventricle, just as she'd suspected. She could see it pulsing weakly, the blood pooling in the pericardial sac. Her fingers found the perforation before anyone could hand her instruments. Clamping. Direct pressure. The hiss of air escaping from the open thoracic cavity. The room's smell shifted, antiseptic and copper and something else, something primal that pulled at the back of her brain like an echo from a cave she'd sealed off 2 years ago. The attending was calling for epinephrine. Push 1 milligram 4. She heard it as if underwater. Her hands were moving, steadying, applying the kind of pressure that came from understanding bone and blood and the fragile mechanics of keeping someone's body conscious of its own survival. The heart monitor showed a rhythm. Faint. Then stronger. Then sinus. 84 beats per minute, and climbing. She didn't step back immediately. She waited until the rhythm was stable, until someone else could take over the pressure, until her presence was no longer the only thing standing between the general and death. Then she moved her hands away. Her scrubs were soaked. Not from the patient's blood, that was contained, surgical, managed. From her own sweat. From the memory of Helmand Province and a 23-year-old named Richardson and the way a man's heart felt when you held it in your hands and refused to let go. The room was still. That's what she noticed first, the absence of the noise that had been there seconds before. No one was calling out orders. No one was moving. They were all watching her. The attending. The trauma nurses. The respiratory therapist with the ventilation bag. They were all watching her like she was something they'd never seen before. Dr. Caldwell's face had gone white. Not the white of shock, the white of recognition. His eyes moved from her blood-soaked hands to her face to the general, whose chest was now rising and falling on the ventilator's rhythm. His mouth opened. Closed. Opened again. The military police arrived 20 minutes later. Natalie didn't see them come in. She was in the sink room, washing the blood away with the kind of methodical care that suggested her hands had done this 1,000 times before. The water ran pink, then clear. She watched it spiral down the drain like time itself was trying to escape. A voice. Young. Male. The careful diction of someone trained in precision. She turned. The Marine was maybe 24, dressed in dress blues crisp enough to cut yourself on, standing in the doorway of the sink room with his cap in his hand and his eyes fixed on the dog tag visible at her neck where her scrubs gaped open. The tag on the broken chain that she wore beneath everything, against her skin, where no one was supposed to see it. His face changed. Not dramatically. The military trained that out of people. But his eyes widened, and his jaw set, and he raised his hand to his ear where a radio piece was fitted, and his voice came out smaller than it had been. Need identification confirmation on the primary responder. Now. She didn't answer him. She just turned back to the sink and continued washing her hands. The water was running clear now. The blood was gone. But her hands wouldn't stop shaking, not from fear, not from trauma, but from the recoil of memory. 2 years of silence. 2 years of being nobody. 2 years of letting people call her careless and unstable and everything small enough to fit in their understanding of who she was. All of it, cracking open like the sternum she'd just spread apart. By the time she left the sink room, Dr. Caldwell had already cornered the charge nurse. She heard his voice as she passed, smooth, regretful, the tone of a man sharing confidential concerns with a trusted colleague. Document that Nurse Hayes performed an unauthorized thoracotomy without physician supervision. I want her badge deactivated before her shift ends. This kind of emotional instability is exactly what we discussed. She's a liability. The charge nurse's face was confused. But she just saved. I'm aware of what she did. Which is exactly why we need to be very careful about how we proceed. She's unpredictable. Potentially dangerous. Get me her personnel file. Natalie didn't stop. She walked past them both like she hadn't heard anything, which was the only lie she'd told in that room all night. Her composure held. Her breathing stayed level. Her hands, finally dry, stayed steady at her sides. But something in her chest, something she'd worked for 2 years to keep sealed, had begun to fracture. In recovery, the general's eyes fluttered open for just a moment. His lips moved. The attending leaned down to catch the words. The nurse. The one who. His voice was barely a whisper. What's her name? Natalie Hayes, sir. The general's eyes widened. His hand tried to move, tried to reach out, but the sedation pulled him back under. His last conscious words before the medication claimed him again were barely audible. Hayes. Helmand. Get me. He faded back into darkness. By midnight, Dr. Caldwell had made 4 phone calls. His voice in each conversation was identical, warm, concerned, the voice of an administrator looking out for his profession. I'm giving you a heads up about a nurse we're letting go, Natalie Hayes. Decorated background, sure, but the emotional instability has become a real concern. Unauthorized procedures. Dangerous judgment calls. Possible substance issues given her inappropriate interest in our pharmacy records. I'd hate to see her harm patients elsewhere. Just a professional courtesy, you understand. He was systematically burning her bridges. Not in anger. In calculation. With the precision of a man who understood that the quietest way to destroy someone was to make sure no one else would ever trust them again. Meanwhile, 3 floors up in the hospital's administrative wing, military intelligence officers were pulling files that had been sealed for 2 years. Service records. Commendations. A classified action in Helmand Province that had left 1 Marine dead and a major's career ended by shrapnel and regulations and a grief that apparently still had teeth. Phone calls were being made to Washington. Natalie didn't know any of this. She drove home in the darkness, her hands still smelling of antiseptic, and found her 16-year-old son Ethan still awake at 2:33 a.m., sitting on the couch in his boxer shorts and an old t-shirt, watching news coverage of the general's collapse on a loop. They're saying someone saved him, Ethan said quietly. Battlefield medicine. In the ER. They're not saying who, but they're showing the hospital and they keep saying it was impossible and that whoever did it was. He trailed off, watching his mother peel off her jacket. Her scrubs were still damp. Her hair was still tied back in the tight bun she'd worn into the hospital. And there, at her neck, the dog tag on the broken chain. His eyes went to that tag, then to her face. "Mom? Was that you?" She didn't answer. She just walked upstairs, and the silence that followed was so complete you could hear the house settling around them both, heavy with all the things that were about to change. The general's heartbeat stabilized on the monitor. Sinus rhythm. Perfect and steady. Natalie stepped back from the operating table, her scrub soaked crimson from collar to hem, her hands trembling not from fear but from something deeper, muscle memory colliding with the ghost of Helmand Province, with the smell of IED-scorched sand, with Marcus's blood mixing with her own on a field surgical table while mortars fell like rain. She pulled off her gloves. They snapped like gunshots against the silence. The young Marine MP stood frozen in the corner, his eyes locked on her face, on the dog tag visible now beneath her torn neckline. She saw the moment recognition crystallized behind his eyes. Not just recognition of her skills. Recognition of her. Major. His voice was barely a whisper. She didn't answer. She turned away, peeling off her surgical mask, and that's when the general's eyes opened. Unfocused at first, then sharpening. He tried to speak, couldn't, the ventilator was doing his breathing for him. But his hand moved across the blanket, searching for hers. Major Hayes. A commander she'd never seen before stepped forward, his uniform immaculate, his presence filling the room like a presence that made the air pressure change. "We're going to need a statement." 3 hours of questioning followed. In a private room that wasn't private at all, with 2 military intelligence officers recording every word while she stood against the wall, still in her bloody scrubs, and explained exactly how she'd performed an emergency thoracotomy using a trauma scalpel because the sterile kit had jammed, how she'd located the bleeder in the descending aorta, how she'd clamped it with fingers that had done this before in a combat support hospital with no anesthesia and mortars shaking the walls. She told them nothing about Helmand. Nothing about Marcus. Nothing about the reason she'd spent 2 years trying to disappear. By the time they finished, it was 6 a.m. The sun was rising over Raleigh like it was any other Tuesday, like a Marine general wasn't in the ICU because Natalie Hayes' hand still remembered how to hold life together. She drove to Oak Creek Memorial through the waking city. The parking lot was already full. Word traveled fast in a hospital. The nurse who'd done something impossible. The nurse who shouldn't exist. She badged into the employee entrance at 6:24 a.m. The access panel beeped red. Access denied. She tried again. Same result. A security guard approached, his expression carefully neutral, a cardboard box in his hands. "Dr. Caldwell left instructions," he said quietly. "Your badge is deactivated effective immediately. These are your personal items from your locker." The box held her jacket, a coffee mug, a spare pair of scrubs folded with brutal precision. Nothing else. She didn't speak. She took the box and drove to Caldwell's office. He wasn't there. Nobody was, except the hospital board convening in the conference room on the 4th floor. Through the glass walls, she could see them arranging papers, could see Caldwell at the head of the table, his jaw tight with the look of a man who'd finally maneuvered his opponent into checkmate. She set the box on a bench outside the conference room doors and walked to her car. The drive to Evergreen Cemetery took 19 minutes. Rain had started falling while she was inside Oak Creek, not gentle rain but the kind that hammered the windshield like applause, like punishment, like the monsoon season in Helm and had followed her across an ocean and a decade. Natalie pulled into the cemetery and parked at the curb, her hand still steady on the steering wheel, every muscle controlled, every breath measured. She walked to Marcus's grave in the downpour. Captain Marcus Hayes, USMC. Beloved husband and father. Beneath it, dates that spanned only 38 years. The inscription was simple, exactly what he would have wanted. No fanfare. No medals listed. Just the facts. Natalie knelt in the mud. The rain soaked through her jeans immediately. She pulled the dog tag from her neck, Marcus's dog tag, the chain broken when she'd torn it from her scrubs in the hospital locker 3 years ago, when she couldn't bear wearing it anymore but couldn't bear throwing it away. She clutched it in her fist until the broken edges cut into her palm. "I failed again," she whispered. "I failed again, Marcus. I can't even stay invisible anymore." The rain hammered her shoulders. Her voice didn't crack. It wouldn't. "I saved that general and it cost me everything. Just like Helmand. Just like you." She opened her fist and looked at the dog tag, at his name stamped in metal. Ethan asked about the medals again. I can't be that person anymore. She died with you. She died in that crater with the shrapnel and the dust, and I don't know how to bring her back. I don't know if I'm supposed to." She heard footsteps on the wet grass before she saw him. Ethan was soaked through, his 16-year-old frame already tall enough to catch her eye, already bearing the stubborn line of his father's jaw. In his hands, he held the shadow box she kept hidden in the attic behind winter clothes and things she never looked at. The oak leaves, polished. The silver star, hanging from its ribbon. 2 bronze stars arranged in precise military order. The purple heart with its distinctive profile of General George Washington. All of it mounted on Marine Corps red velvet. "Mom," Ethan said, his voice steady in a way that broke something open in her chest, "they need to see these." She shook her head. "Ethan, don't. Dad would want them to know." He was already walking back toward his car, the box held in front of him like an offering. Like a challenge. Like a truth that wouldn't stay buried anymore. "Dad would want you to stop hiding. Ethan, come back." But he was driving away, and Natalie was still kneeling in the mud, water running down her face in ways that had nothing to do with the rain, and somewhere inside the hospital across the city, Dr. Caldwell was presenting her termination to the board as a settled matter, as a box to check, as a problem solved. He had no idea what was walking through those hospital doors 12 hours later. He had no idea that the shadow box his patient's teenage son was carrying contained for decades of documentation. That the young Marine with the dawning recognition in his eyes had filed a report that was already in the Pentagon system. That military intelligence doesn't close a file just because a civilian hospital decides to fire an inconvenient witness. The board reconvened at 2 p.m. for what Caldwell believed was a formality. He was mid-presentation, his voice assured, his carefully constructed paper trail laid out like evidence, emotional instability, unauthorized procedures, inability to follow chain of command, when the conference room doors opened. Ethan Hayes walked in first, 16 years old, carrying the shadow box like he was bringing his father home. "My mother is Major Natalie Hayes, Marine Corps." The room went silent. So silent you could hear the fluorescent lights buzz overhead. "Young man, this is a closed meeting," Caldwell started, but the doors opened again. The Marine general stepped through, moving with the careful precision of someone stitched back together 12 hours ago, hospital gown visible beneath a dress uniform jacket that aides had brought him. 2 military officers supported him on either side. He looked directly at Caldwell, then at the board chair, and then at Ethan, and he reached out his hands for the shadow box. Trembling hands. Hands that had given orders to thousands of Marines. "Major Hayes," the general said, his voice rough like it had been dragged through concrete, "I didn't recognize you without the blood and the sand." He opened the box. He read from a service file that appeared in the hand of an aide like magic, or like the Pentagon had been prepared for this exact moment. "Silver Star for Valor under enemy fire." His hands touched each medal as he spoke. 2 bronze stars for meritorious service in combat operations. Purple Heart for injury sustained in action. A naval officer in dress blue stepped forward, commander's insignia gleaming at his collar. Major Hayes commanded field surgical operations in Helmand Province, 2019 to 2021. She performed 43 combat surgeries under direct fire. Survival rate, 96%. The highest in Marine Corps history. Another officer. Another layer of her life, being spoken aloud in this fluorescent-lit conference room that had no idea what it was about to contain. Call sign, Guardian Angel. That's what her unit called her. A captain now, his uniform decorated with ribbons. Caldwell couldn't read fast enough. Because she refused to leave wounded behind. One Marine lost consciousness during a procedure. She continued operating using pure touch and training. No visual confirmation. No instruments. Just instinct and 18 years of muscle memory. Caldwell had gone white. His mouth opened and closed. No sound emerged. The IED attack that killed Captain Marcus Hayes, Major Hayes's husband, occurred during the same engagement where she was performing combat surgery. The general's voice had found its strength again, the voice of a man who'd commanded thousands. She was operating on a lance corporal when the blast hit. The casualty survived. She finished the surgery before allowing field treatment for her own shrapnel wounds. She was hospitalized for 6 months. She was medically discharged because she couldn't hold a scalpel steady anymore. But she could. After 3 years of civilian life, her hands had remembered exactly how. The conference room phone rang. The board chair answered with the caution of someone stepping on thin ice. His face drained of color. It's the Pentagon." The room fell silent. A single voice came through the speaker, calm, measured, the voice of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "This is Deputy Director of Naval Operations. I'm calling regarding the termination of Major Natalie Hayes, retired. I understand the hospital board has voted to discharge her for performing the exact surgical procedures she was trained by the Marine Corps to perform. Is this correct?" The board chair couldn't answer. "Is this correct?" Not a request. A command. We received a report that she performed an unauthorized procedure," the chair began. "Major Hayes performed emergency thoracotomy using field expedient techniques on a Marine general who would be dead without her intervention. This is not a violation. This is exactly what her oath requires. The question before this board now is whether the hospital will be defending Dr. Caldwell's attempt to suppress her or whether you'll be cooperating with the military and federal law enforcement regarding the pharmacy theft she was investigating when this retaliation campaign began." The board chair looked at Caldwell. Caldwell was staring at his carefully constructed papers, at the narrative he'd constructed, at the walls closing in with the speed of a helicopter descent. "The Pentagon is standing by. You have 15 minutes to make a choice," the voice said. "Choose carefully." Her son moved through the hospital boardroom like someone who'd made a decision he wasn't going to unmake. 17 years old, Marcus's jaw, Marcus's stubborn angle to his shoulders. The shadow box of medals was open in his hands, bronze star catching the fluorescent ceiling lights, purple heart gleaming like a warning. Dr. Caldwell was mid-sentence. "And while we certainly respect Nurse Hayes's background, the protocols exist for patient safety, not personal accommodation," he stopped. Everyone stopped. The room did that thing where air gets thick and nobody breathes. Ethan walked to the center of the conference table. The board chair blinked. A woman in navy asked, "Can we help you, young man?" Ethan set the shadow box on the mahogany in front of her. His voice didn't shake. "My mother is Major Natalie Hayes, Marine Corps." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of something. Recognition, maybe. The kind of recognition that changes the shape of a room. Caldwell's smile froze. Gone. Just like that. The Marine general appeared in the doorway behind Ethan, still moving stiff from surgery, still favoring his left side, but he was standing. He was here. He stepped forward and looked directly at Caldwell while he reached for the shadow box. His hands trembled as he opened the file he'd brought with him, the classified jacket that had been in a vault for 2 years. "Major Natalie Hayes," the general said, and his voice had the weight of someone who'd held dying men. "Silver Star for Valor." He paused. "Let that sit." 2 bronze stars for leadership under fire. Another pause. The board members were leaning forward now. Purple Heart. Twice. He looked up from the file. The room went so tight you could hear the air conditioning hum. Major Hayes commanded field surgical operations in Helmand Province and saved 43 lives under enemy fire before an IED attack killed her husband and ended her active service. A woman in dress blue stepped forward from the back of the room, a naval officer, captain rank, the kind of presence that made Caldwell's spine straighten and then immediately collapse again. She read from a second file with precision. Major Hayes holds more decorations for combat medicine than any Marine in her class of 2012. She has performed over 2,000 field procedures in austere environments. She trained 78 medical personnel in emergency trauma response. She holds a standing commendation from CENTCOM for innovations in field surgical technique that are still being taught. The board chair's phone rang. He looked at it. His face changed. He put it on speaker. A voice came through. Calm. Measured. The kind of calm that comes from being obeyed without question. This is the Pentagon. We have a request for Major Natalie Hayes. And we have questions about why a decorated combat surgeon was terminated from Oak Creek Memorial Hospital. A pause. Dr. Caldwell, we're particularly interested in your timeline. Specifically, why did Major Hayes' employment status change 3 days after she saved General Morrison's life? Caldwell stood. Sat back down. His mouth was working but nothing came out. The Pentagon voice continued, we also have questions about why her preliminary documentation regarding pharmacy inventory discrepancies was never forwarded to administration. Those discrepancies, Dr. Caldwell. The ones Major Hayes discovered. The ones you were aware of. The ones that directly preceded her harassment and isolation. The captain in dress blues crossed her arms. Waited. The general looked at Caldwell like he was looking at something that had already died but hadn't figured it out yet. By 6 o'clock that evening, Caldwell was making a phone call to his contact at NBC. By 6:15, he was in the television station's green room, jacket pressed, tie chosen for authority. By 6:30, he was live. The Chiron read, Hospital Administrator defends termination decision. The anchor was sympathetic, the kind of sympathy that eats people alive. Dr. Caldwell, thank you for being here. There's been some unusual developments at Oak Creek Memorial regarding a nurse's termination. Walk us through your decision. Caldwell leaned forward. He'd practiced this. While we certainly respect Major Nurse Hayes' military service, the fundamental issue is one of protocol. She performed an unauthorized surgical procedure. In a hospital setting, protocols exist for patient safety. Military heroism is admirable, but it doesn't exempt healthcare workers from following established procedures. We have to maintain standards. The anchor nodded. We actually have a caller on the line who'd like to respond. Go ahead, please. The voice that came through the studio speakers was clipped, authoritative, unmistakable. It was a voice that had commanded fleets. It was a voice that changed how light moved in rooms. This is General James Matson, Commandant of the Marine Corps. Caldwell's face went the color of wet concrete. Dr. Caldwell. The general's voice didn't rise. That was the worst part. It didn't need to. Major Hayes didn't perform an unauthorized procedure. She performed a field thoracotomy with a surgical scalpel because your thoracotomy kit was jammed. Equipment that should have been immediately accessible for a coding cardiac patient was improperly stored. She saved General Morrison's life using skills she learned saving Marines under enemy fire. Now let's discuss why she was really fired. The studio was dead silent. 2 million viewers. The weather forecaster in the corner wasn't blinking. Major Hayes noticed discrepancies in your pharmacy's morphine inventory, the general continued. 200 units unaccounted for. She documented this discovery the night before you began your campaign to isolate and discredit her. You reassigned her to rotating night shifts so she couldn't track additional patterns. You restricted her access to pharmacy records. You publicly humiliated her during morning rounds to destroy her credibility before she could connect the final dots on your diversion scheme. Caldwell was sweating. Actually sweating. The studio lights caught it. The DEA has been investigating Oak Creek Memorial for 6 weeks, the general said. Major Hayes' documentation provided the evidence they needed to move forward with federal charges. Dr. Caldwell, you didn't fire Major Hayes because of protocol violations. You fired her because she was the only person who could connect you to the morphine disappearance. You tried to discredit her so nobody would believe her paperwork. And then you tried to silence her. The anchor stared at Caldwell. Dr. Caldwell, would you like to respond? He opened his mouth. Nothing came out. Behind the studio glass, federal agents were walking through the parking lot with briefcases and the kind of stride that meant paperwork was ending. 6 months later, Natalie stood in her new office at the Veterans Affairs Medical Center in Washington, D.C. The door read, Chief of Emergency Medicine. Through the window, she watched her trauma team running drills, residents moving with precision, nurses calling out vitals in the shorthand she'd taught them, equipment staged with military efficiency. The dog tag Marcus had pressed into her hand in Helmand Province, the one she'd worn on a broken chain for 2 years, hidden beneath scrubs, hidden from the world, now rested in a frame beside the door. Next to it, a photograph of Ethan standing at his father's grave, holding the metal shadow box. Her phone buzzed. A news alert. Dr. Caldwell, medical license permanently revoked, facing federal charges for controlled substance diversion and witness intimidation, had been spotted selling insurance policies from a folding table in a strip mall parking lot off Capitol Boulevard in Raleigh. The photo showed him in a clearance suit from a discount chain, forced smile, trying to hand a pamphlet to a woman walking past. She didn't even look at him. He was invisible now. The way he'd tried to make Natalie invisible. The world had simply erased him instead. Natalie didn't smile. There was no satisfaction in his erasure, only the weight of 43 lives saved in Helmand, the general she'd brought back from the edge of flatline at Oak Creek, and the thousands of veterans walking through her doors now with injuries and trauma and the need to be seen by someone who understood. Ethan appeared in her doorway. 17, volunteering in the VA's patient transport program, learning what service meant by watching his mother redefine it. Mom, Trauma 2 is asking for you. Marine with a GSW to the lower abdomen. The residents are stuck on the differential. She was already moving. The limp was barely noticeable after 6 months of physical therapy. Her hands were steady. Her voice was steady. The nurse who'd hidden herself for 2 years was gone. In her place stood someone who couldn't hide anymore because too many people now knew what she was. As she scrubbed in, she told the surgical resident, this is a young Marine. Probably 18, 19 years old. He's scared, even if he doesn't show it. We're going to walk him through every step. And then we're going to teach him that his body can heal from this. She looked up from the sink. Her voice dropped an octave. Sometimes the bravest warriors carry stethoscopes, not guns. Now let me show you how we did this in Helmand Province. Her hands moved with the old precision. The muscle memory that had never left. The skills that couldn't be unlearned. As the surgical lights came up and the monitors began their steady beeping, Natalie Hayes stopped being someone who'd survived. She became someone who healed. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value, if you've ever had to hide your strength just to breathe, then you know what Major Hayes just reclaimed. Subscribe for more stories about the quiet warriors among us. The ones who don't ask for recognition, but deserve everything when the truth finally comes out.